me live now is the Deputy Liberal Leader and Shadow Minister for Industry and Skills, Sussan Ley. Thanks so much for your time. First of all, what do you make of the developments over the last 24 hours and the comments from Chris Bowen?
I think that none of the 11 measures that came out of the Energy Ministers' meetings are going to address the energy crisis in the short term. There's reports to be written, there's conversations to be had, there's a regathering in July. And all of that may bode well for the medium and long-term solutions that we need, but it certainly doesn't address the short term. So I think that people that Perrin mentioned, she's my colleague 2 hours down the road in rural and regional Australia, the concerns of people who are facing increased electricity bills and worrying how they're going to pay for them, Laura, and also our small manufacturing businesses who are warning that they will have to shed jobs, lose contracts and in some cases shut down. You know, these are urgent and pressing problems for the government to face.
They certainly are, but they've only been in power less than 3 weeks. So we have to question, how do we get here? Was it the previous government's fault? And what would you do now, other than what the Labor Party has flagged? Do you concede that they're the only levers available to them?
Well, they were aware of the complex and volatile international situation as we were. They actually pointed the finger at us as we left government and they came in, saying that we were blaming overseas events, and they're doing exactly the same thing now. But I completely get it. Australians don't want the finger pointing, but they do want governments to assume that leadership role, take charge and act. And that actually is what the government needs to do now. Now, there's many factors that have led to this, Laura, not least the
but when you say, sorry to interrupt you, I'm really sorry to interrupt, Sussan Ley, but when you say the government needs to act now, what are you saying it needs to do that would solve the problem now?
It needs to build the relationships with gas suppliers. It needs to have firm conversations with state governments. Friendly chats around the table are fine, but the point I was making, Laura, was that the refusal of both, particularly Victoria with its gas moratorium for onshore gas exploration, and the very slow process in New South Wales, you contrast that with Queensland and WA, means we have this shortage of domestic gas supply. So there are issues that need to be addressed now, and they do relate to confidence for both the suppliers of gas and the consumers who are relying on the government to reassure them. And I want to make one point that relates to me as Environment Minister. So I approved extensions to 3 coal mines as Environment Minister, understanding the need for baseload dispatchable supply. I approved the Santos Narrabri project to a hail of criticism, to be mocked by the now government, who at best stood on the sidelines and at worst called gas a fraud. So, you know, that confidence in the industry with the current government at the time of these difficult conversations is probably lacking. But look, I wish them well. It's an important task. It matters to all of us.
Well, let's talk about Narrabri, because that was tied up in red and green tape for, you know, years and years and years. You talk about New South Wales, the New South Wales government, and needing to get them to come to the table on more gas supply. I do want to point out that that is a Liberal national government as well. You being of the same colour, you couldn't convince them while you were in power. How's a Labor government going to do that? But also on the Narrabri plant, that is not used for residential gas. Correct me if I'm wrong. That is used for projects, but not individual households. Is that a significant? Could that significantly help if that was changed?
Well, our role as a federal government was to efficiently and effectively approve what came before us with the strictest environmental conditions, and I did that with every project. But as I said, there were a lot of naysayers at the time. And what I'm hearing and have been hearing is how quickly can we get Narrabri on stream? So that call was made a week ago and it's continuing. And of course, the more supply you have, the more easily this problem is solved because it does relate to supply. But Laura, if we step back, you know, the energy crisis is something that really, really does matter to every single Australian small business. And as the incoming Shadow Minister for Small Business, I really want to highlight the effect it will have on people who've mortgaged their homes for their small businesses, on people who can't get a pool of talented workers, for whom that balance between energy security and the introduction of renewables that I believe we as a coalition got right and in opposition have right is absolutely critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you point out, the states have a lot of power here. Do you concede, therefore, that the Albanese government needs to deal within those constraints?
Well, the Albanese government will do what it does. I mean, it's in government now. I'm not going to provide gratuitous advice. It's all about the hard decisions of sitting around a table and working through solutions. Now, this is a big problem, but government is hard. We found this with a global pandemic. We sat around the table and we worked hard at solutions in an escalating international crisis that affected everybody's, fear for their own lives and their families. We didn't get everything right, and we acknowledge that, but we worked it through. So, best of luck to them in doing that. And the opposition's role is to hold them to account, to provide effective criticism, and to point out shortcomings where we see them.
Sure, there's not a gas crisis on the West Coast because they do quarantine at least 15% for domestic use. It is less on the East Coast. Do you think we need to do what the West is doing?
All of those options should be on the table for the government. 40% of Queensland's gas supply is domestic. The shortage, the absolute refusal by Daniel Andrews to do anything about onshore gas exploration in Victoria has, I believe, really contributed to the East Coast problem. Yeah. Again, I know I'm pointing the finger and I know people don't like that, but we have to know where we were and where we've come from to understand where we have to go.
Given the closer relationship between Dan Andrews and Anthony Albanese, perhaps Anthony Albanese can bend his arm a little bit and bring him over the line. Is that what you're getting at there?
So good relationships between states and the Commonwealth always work well and work for the benefit of people when they happen. But I think history tells us that often that isn't the case. Again, I come back to my point, sitting around the table, applying skills, bringing strong relationships to bear and working hard are vital in every aspect of state-Commonwealth relations.
If I could just ask you one final question, because the one thing that has been noticeable in the opposition really getting stuck into Labor is this off-budget spending of upgrading transmission lines. Isn't that exactly what we need for a government to look ahead, years ahead, perhaps even a decade ahead, to upgrading these lines, investing in that infrastructure so we don't have the situation that we've got now?
Of course we need to look at that. Of course we need to look at upgrading transmission lines, but you've just mentioned 10 years, a decade ahead. What we need to do is get the balance right between the transition to renewables and the offset of that against energy security right here, right now. So pointing to these things that need to happen and that we should all be working on are not an answer to the current crisis. And they effectively are, I think, the government saying, look over there, and pointing to something else that is not really where their focus should be right now.
Okay, Sussan Ley, appreciate your time. We'll speak soon.
Thank you.